Good evening, podcast listeners, and welcome to episode 8 of the MeG Players podcast. Tonight, we turn our attention to the Chariot period of MeG, and specifically the Egypt and Hatti PDF. The podcast is the Armies of the Bronze Age Catastrophe and focuses on the Sea Peoples arriving and the enemies they fought. We look at three lists, including the Sea Peoples, and we also play tested 2 of the lists against each other. And I hope you enjoy what actually turned out to be a fascinating podcast for us to make. And without further ado, we will crack on with the main content of the podcast. Right, so what we're going to do tonight is look at the Armies of the Bronze Age Catastrophe. This is a biblical period, and what we're going to do is we're also going to look at the history. Richard's going to lead on the history, very knowledgeable about that, and then we are going to look at 3 armies that each of us put together, and intertwined into that discussion will be an actual play test of the 2 armies that Richard and I put together. We actually got to get them on the table and have a fist fight. So, without further ado, Richard, Armies of the Bronze Age Catastrophe. Makes it sound quite sexy.
Thank you, Ray. So, in terms of the history, we're probably in the last part of the 13th century BC and the first part of the 12th BC. A word of caveat here that anything beyond sort of 680 BC, date-wise, is very speculative. There's it's quite possible that these dates are actually wrong, but this is what's known as the conventional chronology, which was drawn up in I think it's the early 20th century, basically from the lists of ruling kings of Egypt and to some extent Hittites and Babylonian kings as well. And it provides a broad indication of the dates. But there have been various attempts to revise the chronology, most famously probably David Roll's book, A Test of Time. And while it is perfectly possible there are definitely problems with conventional chronology, it still seems to be the sort of basic starting determining dates with sort of earlier periods of civilization. So what is the Bronze Age catastrophe? Well, it's essentially the point in time at which both the Mycenaean and the Hittite empires collapse. Apparently from invasions by various different tribes who became known as Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples is actually a 19th century name given by a French Egyptologist called Emmanuel de Rouget, and it's based on the fact that the Egyptian sources describe these invaders come by sea, and there's famously a letter from the ruler of Ugarit asking for help because his army has gone off to fight somebody else and these invaders have come by sea. So over a period, a fairly brief period of sort of certainly no more than 50 years, a lot of cities in modern Turkey and what was known as Anatolia, Syria, Cyprus, and the major cities in Greece and the Greek islands, they all show evidence of devastation. So the archaeologists in excavating these places all found at the same sort of time that these cities had been burnt or sacked. And this is basically the Bronze Age catastrophe. Along with this, we also know that the Egyptians defeated at least 2 invasions from these Sea Peoples, one in combination with Libyan tribes as well. What is interesting, however, is that the Assyrians, who are further to the east, they seem to have been largely unaffected. So the Assyrian cities don't show the same devastation. So it seems to have been restricted to the Mediterranean area, the Eastern Mediterranean primarily. So there were a number of different theories as to why we suddenly get this huge disruption of these civilizations and all the cause of this catastrophe. And over the years, these have included earthquakes. There was a suggestion that the earthquakes demolished the city walls, and this allowed the traders and pirates to overrun these cities. Migrations. There's the big theory that tribes migrated from the north and overran the armies and defences of the empires, and that caused it. Another theory suggested that it was ironworking, that these tribes had access to iron weapons, and that gave them a huge advantage. Another theory was drought, that basically the cities starved. Drought meant the crops failed and they couldn't feed and defend the cities. Yet another theory was that there was a collapse in the trade networks, that all of a sudden this disrupted the economics and the cities couldn't produce the products, and that led to the whole collapse. The idea that it was just an increase in the number of raiders in the Eastern Mediterranean, or that perhaps one of the most recent proposed by Robert Drews was that the fact that these tribes actually brought an innovation in warfare. And up till that point, warfare had largely been an aristocratic thing carried out by the wealthy aristocracy who could afford chariots and armour and acted as a sort of elite, whereas all the infantry were just peasants who didn't know which end of the stick to hold. And that what these tribes brought along was a sort of mass of infantry who can use a sword and throw javelins and overwhelm these empires. It could be any of these. It could be all of these. I have to say, I think some of the theories are far-fetched. Certainly, is just to be a single cause. But whatever the combination of factors were, it's clear that there was a complete disruption in the Eastern Mediterranean, and that led to the collapse of the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean Empire, and the invasions of Syria. And so you have to ask yourself, well, who were these sea peoples? We have a whole range of names. So some of the early ones we hear about include the Shurdan, the Ekwesh, the Teresh, the Luka, and the Shekle. These were all tribes which were actually beaten by Merinptah, who is the Egyptian pharaoh. We also hear of other tribes that invaded Syria. These include the Cheka, the Denyen, the Weshwesh, the Sheklesh again, and the Pelisset. These various tribes, we don't know if they all came from the same place and different. There are a few clues. Some of them we can sort of tie into location, either from archaeological similarities in the cultural kind, or from other sources give name adjacent to the place. So examples of these include the Shurdan, and they seem to originate in the sort of Sardinia area. There are similarities, for example, between helmets, the boar's tusk helmets that exist and are shown on some of the images and some of the archaeology, for example. Similarly, the Sheklesh have been linked to the Sickles, who were the original tribe from which we get the name Sicily. So it seems that at least some of the sea peoples may have come from that more central Mediterranean area. We also have example of the Luka. They seem to be linked to the area of Lycia in Anatolia. So it may well be that some of the tribes actually originated around the borders of the Hittite Empire, or the area between the Hittites and Mycenaean civilization. And then we also have the Peliset. Now, the Peliset are probably the ones we can track the best, because they definitely seem to have originated as a Mycenaean group. And this we know because the Pelisets were settled in Palestine. It's from where we get the name Palestine from. And we know that the pottery that they produced in Palestine is very similar to pottery which previously was found in the Mycenaean sites. And we also know that they used the Linear B writing script, which is the script that the Mycenaeans used. So we can be fairly sure that the Peliset at least seem to have been a Mycenaean group that became a wandering tribe. Other names are a bit more speculative. An example would be the Denyen. They have been equated with the Danioi, who are mentioned as an Anatolian tribe fighting on the side of the Greeks in the Iliad. So if we believe that the Iliad is a record of a siege of Hittite allied Troy by the Greeks, the Mycenaean Greeks, then it is possible that some of these tribes were allied to the Greek, the Trojan. So it's, as with everything in this part of history, there's a small amount of sources on which we try to construct a huge amount of history, but it is undoubtedly a disruptive period which sees the collapse of the Hittite Empire. The Greeks go from the Mycenaean civilization into what's commonly referred to as a Dark Age, from which they emerge around sort of 700 BC into what becomes the Greek civilization that we know about. So that's our sort of history.
It's really tempting to say that often the simplest explanation is often the correct one, but it doesn't seem to be any real cohesive thought about where these people came from and how it really is. There's a lot of different explanations of why.
It seems to show there was a sort of collapse of the certainly the main empires that controlled the sort of Eastern Mediterranean, and maybe that allowed a rise of piracy. That in turn, maybe there were climatic or other factors that led to some migrations of these tribes. That would be my guess. But at the end of the day, it was no doubt interesting times, as the Chinese curse goes. One where you probably didn't want to be around, really.
I think I'd certainly go for some combination of effects. I mean, there's you mentioned drought, and there are records certainly for the Hittites seem to have been suffering at times towards the end of their empire. I mean, they were actually importing grain from Egypt at points. So that could that can sort of weaken their empire. And the Hittites always strike me as actually it's a miracle that their empire lasted so long anyway. Because if you sort of look at it, they're sort of their core lands sit in the middle of Anatolia, and they're surrounded. They're often invaded from multiple directions. Some droughts, fractious neighbours. You get multiple causes. I have to say, because you mentioned it, I feel I have to comment. I was somewhat unconvinced by Drew's book when I read it many, many years ago. But there could be something in it. Don't want to throw it out entirely.
The problem with Drew's theory I have is that the chariot doesn't disappear. It re-emerges, and it's only later on that the chariot disappears as a weapon of warfare, really with the introduction of cavalry. So the idea that that it was the innovation of warfare by itself does seem suffers from that sort of fatal flaw.
Yes, I do. The Assyrians are the sort of the elephant in the room on that one, aren't they? They carry on having a large and effective chariotry arm for centuries.
Yes.
And whereas Drew's basically claims that the rampaging javelin throwing swordsmen spelt the end of the chariot, which obviously wasn't the case.
I think it's probably worth talking a bit about the different troop types themselves, and particularly the chariot system. It's worth noting that pretty much everything you read on the internet should be taken with caution. There is a huge amount of misinformation and very little of what actually quotes sources or quotes them reliably. And I found this in particular was really challenging. And
sorry, are you talking about chariots or politics or life or generally the internet? Is that what you're talking about?
Generally anything about the ancient weapon systems of the various armies of the period particularly around the Bronze Age period. So, when you get past that, actually going back to the genuine sources that are available, then it's a bit more revealing. For example, we know quite a lot of the chariot system used by the Hittite Egyptians and the Assyrians, largely because we actually have Hurrian training manual on how to train your chariot horses and pairs, and it was written by somebody called Kikuli, and it was actually found at Hattusa, written in Hittite. There is, I believe, more than one example. There are other examples of this manual in fragments, but the main extensive one, the copy was found at Hattusa. The important thing is that the chariot was a missile. At this stage, it was drawn by 2 horses and had a crew of 2. Now, the first thing to say is you hear a lot about in chariot runs. Well, the problem with this is that there is absolutely no evidence for chariot runners. There is no word for chariot runners, and there is almost no evidence. And I say almost because I have to have a slide. The evidence for chariot runners seems to depend on the Ramesseum, which is at Thebes in Egypt, not Greece. It's always confusing when they have 2 places. And that relief does show a third map on one group of Hittite chariots. And it seems from this that the whole idea that chariots had a sort of third person who would run alongside the chariot or be carried by chariot and would fight. It seems to that whole theory developed from that sort of. The problem is that there is no other evidence to support this. The training manuals have no suggestion of ever having a third person on them, and there's no other examples of chariots with 3-man crew. The most likely explanation is that the Ramesseum is actually showing a third infantryman, because in this case, the Hittite chariots were carrying a third infantry to attack the Egyptian camp. If you remember the Battle of Kadesh, the Hittites ambushed the Egyptians and attacked the Egyptian camp. And that may be the suggestion of why the relief on this occasion shows a third crew member. But this doesn't seem to be a crew member who fought with the chariots. When chariots fought chariots, I think you could visualize this as a sort of 2-dimensional dogfight. So there seems to be the idea that the chariots would operate in pairs almost, with one chariot acting as a wingman for another chariot, so that they would sort of like a dogfight. You'd head into the melee, shoot off your arrows at any target, come out the other side, try and figure out what the hell went on, and then if you were still okay, go back into the fight. I mean, it seems to be very similar to a sort of World War II dogfight, where the pilots will say that basically once you were in a dogfight, all hell broke loose. You had no idea what was going on. You fired off a few bursts, and you then came out of the other side hoping that you were intact. And unless you were very skilled and experienced, that was about it. Against infantry, however, the tactics of chariots actually seem to be very similar to horse archers. We know from the training manuals that the way they trained the chariots was they would go around a sort of circuit in sort of groups of 10. And the basic idea, they basically created a circuit by putting two poles sort of about 100, 120 yards apart, I think it is. And basically the 10 chariots head in sort of column towards the infantry target. They shoot as they come in. They then do a very sharp turn, shoot as they do the turn, and shoot as they retreat. And the idea seems to be to get at least 8 shots in one circuit. And basically they were trained to repeat these circuits, sort of at least 8. So the chariot horses were expected to basically sort of be going at fairly full speed, sort of canter and gallop, for pretty much a mile, which is about the limit even today of modern horses in terms of keeping sort of full speed. And that, if you think of modern races, all the classics are short races for flat racing, where they're doing the sort of top speed. But if you in that time, it's potentially possible for a chariot, the archer on the chariot, to get off about 80 arrows per chariot, so 800 arrows from 10 chariots. And you think you could do that into a frontage of perhaps 10, 20, 30 yards. That's an awful lot of arrows going into a very condensed frontage. And that would probably be more than enough to disrupt the formation and break the confidence of infantry, at which point the infantry break, and then the chariot is a perfect weapon to follow up, routing, shooting the straggler in the back, keeping formation away.
That was scary, wouldn't it? Scary as hell, that.
Yeah, I mean, there's other supporting information. In training, they set poles with copper targets. Now, the source I find, but I can't verify this, says they were set 12 meters apart. Now, that seems to me actually very close together. I looked at also the sources talk about Mongols and the way they trained and the horse archers. And in horse archery, they reckon to shoot at 3 targets set 30 meters. So if you've got copper targets on poles that are only 12 meters, it seems to me that's too close together to shoot at a target. But possibly you were trained to shoot at every other target, something like that. It's reckoned a skilled archer can probably get 1 shot every 2 seconds, which is still a hell of a skill. It's not something I'd like to try anyway. So that's the chariot system in the east, used by the Hurrians and the Mitanni, and adopted by the Egyptians. In the west, you get the Mycenaean chariots, and these seem to be more substantial. The Hurrian chariots are light enough that one person can carry them easily, and there's lots of records of them being carried. The Mycenaean chariots are much more substantial, and there they seem to focus on fighting, the fighting warriors having spears and javelins. And we get some supporting evidence that they were not particularly bow plans, they were more used with spears and javelins. So that's sort of reflected in the army lists. The difference with the Sea peoples is that these tribes and armies appear to be mainly infantry. If they were coming from sea, that makes a lot of sense because it's quite a challenge to try and transport chariots and horses over sea in boats. And the surviving images and archaeology basically tends to show them equipped with possibly a helmet. I've mentioned the boar's tusks helmets, but there are other forms as well. You get shields, you get spears, javelins, and most notably swords, some of which are definitely starting to become iron. The use of iron actually predates the arrival of the Sepals, which is the main reason why the introduction of iron doesn't seem to for the Bronze Catastrophe. But the use of iron definitely increases as you start iron sword.
Can I just chip in a sort of snippet?
Please.
I pick couple of snippets I picked up just to reinforce what Richard's just been saying about, this is the great age of the chariot, and the chariot was the dominant weapon system, and the tactics he's just described, that if not actually recorded, are inferred from the records we've got and do seem very logical. But there are a few bits and pieces in the historical record that do suggest that you didn't need a lot of chariots sometimes to have a big effect. There's a whole series of correspondence known as the Armana Letter from Egypt, which includes some requests from allies or subject princes in Palestine and Canaan to the Egyptian pharaoh, asking for help against trouble. And sometimes they were requesting sort of send half a dozen chariots and some infantry, and that'll be great. And there's one record, probably somewhat boasting and exaggerated, about a Hittite king accompanied by 6 chariots who met what is quoted as being an army, but is unlikely to be an army. So the king and his 6 bodyguard chariots then go on to defeat this, quote, army all by themselves. So
probably a group of bandits who were...
Yeah, I suspect, but it does seem to be the case. Well, there's a few of us in chariots, we're okay. We're going to ride around and shoot you up.
Yeah, well, you can always get away again, I guess.
Yeah, because
the
reconstructed chariots people have made do seem to be able to go at quite a lick of speed, and those would have been done without fully trained horses. It's all very impressive.
Very manoeuvrable. Right, so if we bring this back to MeG, what we're talking about in terms of the lists is the Chariot period list, aptly named. And we were then given a challenge to choose an army from who fought. Were either the Sea Peoples or fought against the Sea Peoples? Was that correct, Rick?
That's correct. Yes.
And okay, so we chose 3 lists, and we're going to give Richard a bit of a break now. So, Richard, I'll just say you chose the Sea People.
Yes, I did.
And Nick, you chose. What did you choose?
I chose the Hittites. I've always had a bit of a soft spot for them.
Yeah. And I chose the New Kingdom Egyptians. And we had one game, Richard and I, Sea Peoples versus New Kingdom Egyptians, to try out the lists. But what we'll do is we'll go through the lists. We'll look at, and we'll start with Nick, then me, then Richard, to give Richard a bit of a break. And we'll see what was available to us and the choices we made. And obviously the lists themselves will be in the usual place on the blog, and that will be mentioned in the notes to this podcast. So, Nick, you chose...
As I said, Hittite Empire.
Empire.
All the lists we're talking about tonight come from the Egypt and Hatti PDF, which covers the period, this great period of chariot warfare, and the chariots were dominant. So I've gone for the Hittite Empire list, runs from 1400 BCE to 1180 BCE. Obviously, as Richard's already mentioned, dates a bit wobbly, and certainly around the start of what historians call either the Hittite New Kingdom or the Hittite Empire is a bit ropey, and we certainly don't have very good details of dates for. I think it's the king. Anyway, the list itself, the generals available are professional, army commander and up to 3 sub-generals. It can have 2 internal ally generals, which can be professional or instinctive, and these are to represent Anatolian vassals. I'll come to that shortly. So the Hittite part of the list, top of the list, and absolutely quite rightly so, are the golden chariot fighters. These are the king's elites. These are chariots. They're drilled loose, exceptional, protected, skilled bow. You can have 0 to 6s. They're the best of the chariots. Presumably, if you have 6, they're the 6 guys who are with the king I just mentioned. So it's literally one chariot is one chariot. Okay, maybe not.
The 6 superheroes.
Yes, 6 great heroes. After that, you can have 4 to 16 Hittite chariots, which are exactly the same, drilled loose, but they're superior against skilled bow. There is an option to upgrade Hittite chariots with a 3rd man. Richard's already touched on this is dubious. We don't really know. It's based on the Kadesh account and the carvings at the Ramesseum. Basically, this allows you to add melee expert to the Hittite chariot. I'll say up front now, I haven't chosen it because I certainly tend to agree with the thing Richard mentioned about it was a temporary carrying a man, so I don't. Hittite infantry, you can have a unit of guard spearmen, drilled loose, superior protected, short spear. The bulk of the infantry are just Hittite spearmen, again drilled loose, average protected, short spear. The Hittites had a standing army. You can have a few tribal loose versions of those for less good infantry. And there's Hittite conscripts, tribal loose, poor unprotected, short spear, just the levy dregs. You can have a unit of Casca, also known as Gascons, tribal loose, average protected, devastating chargers. The Gascons were wild hillmen north of the Hittite realm, a perennial problem, but they did to the army. Some of them were even termed pacified, possibly a bit optimistic. You can have 0 to 18 skirmishing archers and 0 to 12 slingers. I mentioned the Anatolian. The list includes an Anatolian vassal contingent, 2 of these, or 2 generals, and a bit unusual for the list. These are compulsory. 4 to 8 chariots who are formed loose, superior protected, experienced bow, so they're not as good as it's proper. Alternatively, you can regrade these with experienced javelin and short spear. Again, that was Richard was mentioning earlier, western end of Anatolia and facing over into Greece, possibly a different style of chariot. There's 6 to 12 Anatolian spearmen, tribal loose, average protected, short spear. And again, they can have some archers and slingers. Although this is compulsory contingent, you don't have, oddly, and it does reflect the history, you don't actually have to have it commanded by an allied general. Optionally, it could be commanded by a Hittite subgeneral, so it can fit into the command structure that way if you want. It reflects the sometimes very close nature of the alliances, and sometimes the allies were commanded by Hittites. You can have a couple of allies in the list, Mitanni allies or Syro-Canaanite allies, which you can have up to 2 contingents. And again, the Syro-Canaanites are a bit odd in terms of being an ally contingent, because one of these Syro-Canaanite contingents can again be commanded by a Hittite subgeneral rather than an ally general. And this is because for the Syrian states of Carchemish and Aleppo, or at least those are more modern names, they were actually ruled by a Hittite viceroy who could sometimes actually be a prince, a son of the king. So they were very reliable and could act very closely with the Hittite central authorities and the Hittite army. So you can it's just an interesting difference on that if you wanted to take those allied, get the troops from the allied contingents, but not actually have them under an allied general, which I think could be unique amongst the army lists, Richard. I can't think of anyone else who gets that. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Possibly.
Out of the X hundred army lists we've got. Anyway, certainly there's not many if there are any others. Okay, so that was what I had to choose out of. And, like a lot of the armies of this period, its main troops are chariots. So my actual army choice majors on chariots. It's a bit of a Hittite Empire panzer division, and people with long memories going back to WRG 5th edition might remember the infamous ancient British panzer, an army feature of that back that's going back to the 70s now, isn't it? So that's really showing. Anyway, to stop waffling on, my generals, I've chosen 3 Hittite generals. Obviously, you have to have a Hittite army commander, all competent professional. And I have gone for an ally, and I've gone for talented instinctive for the Anatolian ally. for exactly the same points, you could have another competent professional Hittite general, so fits into the possible allocation of cards and such like. But in the end, I wanted the extra card. So the way to do that was talented. I've come out with a PBS of 7 and 4 scouting cards, which is nice. The actual troops in the army. Nobody will be surprised to hear that I've taken all 6 of the Golden Chariot fighters. I mean, quite frankly, for me, yeah, that just goes on the list. You don't even ask any questions about it. So 6 exceptional skill shooting chariots. I've then gone for 4 units, each of 4 of the Hittite Chariots, the drilled loose, superior protected, skilled bow. So that's all of those. The compulsory Hittite spearman unit, you have to have 8. Drilled loose, average protected. That's my Hittite infantry. I've not gone for any more. So not really tried to have any. In the Anatolian contingent, I've got 2 4 base units of chariots with bow again. They're superior protected, experienced bow, which is a sort of an interesting classification. They're not quite as good as shooting as the Hittites, but they're still superior. So if they get shot at by skilled shooters, the skilled shooters won't go to greens. Might be a factor if they were fighting the Egyptians. The compulsory unit of Anatolian spearmen I've downgraded to poor. They're tribal loose, short spear. So those are the tugs. But to go with this army, I've gone for 5 sugs, which is not what I'd normally go for. Possibly a bit of a gimmick, but I thought this is a shooty army. I've taken all the actual chariot shooters. So what else can I get? I've gone for 3 6 base units of average experienced bow combat shy archers, a 6 of the same as slingers, and they're all Hittite, and then a 9 base unit of average experienced bow Anatolian archers. So I've got 5 more shooty sugs. So I mean the usage of the army, I think, is fairly obvious. You're looking to shoot people, lots and lots and lots. And it partly taken with the idea that the concept of these lists of fighting the sea peoples, who are lots and lots of infantry. So this is all about degrading them, but also with the thought of fighting the Egyptians, possibly annoy them quite a bit with all the extra shooting from your skirt. So this is an army that will be looking for an open table. No doubt Richard will say his sea peoples would be looking for one with quite a lot of terrain in to negate the chariots. We're looking for lots of open space, lots of shooting, gang the shooting. You're going to gang quite a chunk of skilled shooters up at probably one end of the enemy's line if you can, or at least one point, and try and blow a hole in it and move on to the next. So there you are. That was my choice. I will look forward to Richard and Ray's comments. Oh, sorry, last thing, it's got a poor unfortified camp.
You managed to get 7 PBS and 4 scouting.
Yes.
His hand.
Yeah, the massive skirmishers helps that scouting. I've probably got an extra scouting point.
Yeah.
Just from the skirmisher infantry.
I like it, and it become clear when you hear what the army I chose. I reserve judgment to see whether New Kingdom Egyptian can actually do it better than Hittite Empire. I don't know the answer, but I just wonder if it can.
I understand where you're coming from with the army, Nick. I'm disappointed it doesn't have infantry, but it's the sort of maxed out on chariot version.
It's got all the chariots that it can have in the list without taking another ally.
Yeah, it's so you've got 11 files of skilled shooters and a probably similar number of sort of experienced shooters, with a relatively high scouting and PBS, ought to control the terrain. So yeah, it's a pain for sea people. Because there's nothing to get your teeth into. But historically, that's what gave the sea people's troubles.
Approaching this with the idea of the theme, if you like, that there will be a sea people's army there. The Hittites infantry is just worse than the sea people's infantry. So why? The question in my mind was, why get into an infantry fight?
Indeed. So I can understand.
But we weren't necessarily just trying to tailor our armies to fight the sea people, were we? Well, maybe we were.
I think you were, guys.
It was definitely in my mind with this one, but there was thinking about the Egyptians as well, and I will put it this way: I am now very seriously thinking of getting the toys for this army, but I would also get extra infantry figures to be able to do a version with more infantry in it. So
right, so I chose New Kingdom Egyptian, and if we look at the PDF, I think the lads reminded me before we started recording, you can have a lot of different armies from this PDF. You going down the list, you get superior chariots, loads of them. You get up to 24. You get Pharaoh's chariots, which are the same as Nick's golden chariot fighters. 6 of those. You can have Egyptian Royal Guard, which are drilled loose, superior protected, short spear, melee expert. But you only get 4 of them. I know short spear, melee expert. In fact, superior, short spear, melee expert, pretty damn cool. They're loose, but you only get 4. You get some close fighters, drilled loose, average protected, short spear, up to 24 of those. You can change up to a quarter of those to close fighters with heavy axe, and they become short spear melee expert. And I think you can put some of those bases in with the close fighters, or not have them as separate unit, I believe. Archers, infantry drilled loose, average protected, experienced bow, and then you're into some tribal loose, unskilled javelin, some light archers, which are skirmishers, Nubian archers, skilled bow, Nubian skirmishers, skilled bow, and so actually, yes, so skirmishing javelinmen, infantry skirmishers, you got slingers, and then you get this Syro-Canaanite contingent who are just part of the army, and then you start from date. In specific dates, you get the Shardana Royal Guard, infantry drilled loose, superior to short spear melee expert. There's again only 4 of those. Another way of regrading the close fighters, you can bring some Libyan spearmen in who are infantry tribal loose, average unprotected, short spear, devastating chargers. Pretty quite interesting. 8 to 18 of those, and Sherdan infantry tribal loose, average protected, good javelin, short spear, and you can have melee expert shoot and charge with those. It'd be quite tasty, up to 18 of those. And you've got sea people. You can get sea people colonists, and they're infantry tribal loose, average protected, unskilled spear. So I think the 3 basic armies you can have a min-max chariot army. I think you can have a chariot, 2-wing chariot army with some solid foot. Or I think you can do, if you want to, a big infantry army which has a lot of tribal infantry in it. So I don't know if you guys agree, but those are really the 3 broad choices without going into the key-picky of what you can have with the New Kingdom Egyptians. So very flexible. I think I'm motivated to get more of the figures after what I saw. I, of course, went for the min-max chariot army. with
Kingdom Egyptian Panzer Division.
Yes, with absolutely no collusion with Nick Goutrogger. I went for that.
No, I can say we never talked about it, did we? We never prepared notes.
And my army was interesting. So I had 4 competent generals, competent professional generals, which gave me the command and control I thought I needed. I ended up with PBS of 7, scouting 3, and the army was the Pharaoh's chariots, 6 of those, so exceptional, drilled loose, exceptional practice, skilled bow, and then 1, 2, 3, 5, 6 4s, which is the maximum of the chariots, which are chariots drilled loose, superior protected, skilled bow, and then a 6 of the Syro-Canaanite chariots 4 loose, average protected, skilled bow. Then I had 2 units of close fighters, and I downgraded them in raised fashion. So they're infantry 4 loose, poor protected, short spear, coming in at 41 points each, 6 of those, and 2 6s to make up the minimum of 8. And then I had 8 archers, infantry 4 loose, poor protected, experienced bow, And the only reason they have experienced bows because I have the points. There was no other reason. I couldn't find any better use of it. But I'd never used an army like this before, and so I'm not saying I was picking from experience. I'm saying I was picking for lovely toys, and the idea was with my choice of army was to shoot, and then deliver a coup de grace somewhere, and get behind the enemy and make it nasty. And
welcome to my world of shooty mounted.
Yes. No. And the first time I'd ever used a shooty cavalry army, the Chariots of cavalry, and I had 18 files of skilled shooters, which I rather liked.
I think it's 17, but I'll give you.
Okay, 17.
Or maybe it's 18. No, maybe I'm wrong. I can't.
Yeah, it should be an even number.
Even number, yeah. Sorry.
So 18 files of skilled shooters, which is quite handy. And I'll mention the game that Richard and I played. I'd never used this kind of army before, so I think I was a little ponderous when I was using it and trying to work out, how far to be away from the infantry and all this, evading and everything. And I didn't win with the army against Richard, but if I remember correctly, Richard, it was a pretty close run thing.
It was a very close run.
and I loved it. I really enjoyed using it. So shit, I might have to go to the dark side with the Horsemeister.
Oh dear.
So that's how I remember it. I remember it being an interesting game because games Richard are always interesting, but a type of army I'd never used before, and unashamedly gaming the system, doing the min-max. And I don't think Richard's even going to say he was disappointed with me, because he would never be disappointed with me doing a min-max army to get the most skilled shooters on the board.
It's no disappointment at all. It was a real test of a sort of big tribal army with lots of infantry face nasty skilled army.
If I remember rightly, you managed to out-scout me, which was hilarious.
You only get 3 scouting.
I only have 3 scoutings.
Which, yes, so your chariots don't help you as much as you might expect. I think Nick managed 4 through his large numbers of skirmishing foot as well.
Yeah.
You could argue against the sea peoples. Do you actually need your chariots to be superior?
Well, I don't want to just tailor it to the sea peoples, although that was, the game we had. But I thinking about what I might do with this army, actually, the next list, what I'm thinking would be quite interesting would be to reduce all the chariots, all the 4s of chariots to average, keep the skilled bow, and then not really change anything else, but get an exceptional professional general, army commander in. Legendary, sorry, yeah, legendary. You know me, I don't really know the rules. A legendary general as the army commander, and put that legendary general with the Pharaoh's chariots, and just be Pharaoh. Why not? Be the Pharaoh. And
this is the Ramesses propaganda.
This is the Ramesses as he saw himself.
Yeah.
You'd have to represent your general with a 28mm model.
Oh, I think 54mm for Ramesses, surely.
But it does. I mean, look, the list does say any professional, so I can have a legendary if I want to.
Indeed.
So anyway, so in my revised list, I'd have to mess around with the points a little bit to try and fit it in. But I think that would just be a fantastic list, because that's exceptional protected chariots with a legendary general attached to them are going to go through.
Yeah, and it's the same general that the New Kingdom Egyptian list, as Ray has already alluded to, because of all its options, is one of the more flexible lists in this period. As you say, it can be at least 3 different of arms.
Absolutely. I mean, personally, I've kind of done tribal infantry.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I didn't really want to build a tribal infantry list. I'm thinking that Richard would probably tell us there are better tribal infantry lists than what you can build with this. And I find, so I know Simon, the creator of MeG, has a list which has got some okay foot and 2 wings of chariots. And I know the foot's just got target on it.
I've every time I've looked at this, I've wondered, actually, it might be interesting to do the later version, the Sea People's Colonists and all that. I suspect what you get out of that is an army a bit like what the army I assume Richard will be showing us next, which is lots of those tribal infantry with unskilled javelin and melee X, but then with a small but pretty powerful skilled shooting chariotry arm, which the Sea Peoples don't get. So, it would be, and of course, the professional commanders as well. And possibly not to overlook a couple of units of drilled close fighter might be useful just because you've got some infantry who are a bit more maneuverable. Obviously, it wouldn't end up as big as I'm expecting Richard's army. And I'm sure Richard's army's got some other toys as well. But it is certainly, if you wanted a one list with lots of options, it's a good one.
Now that I agree with.
And
you wanted to start, if you were starting out on your MeG journey and you wanted a chariot period army, and you like painting, you can make them look beautiful.
You can.
I think that's a good choice. I think New Kingdoms is a good choice. And I know there are some people on one of the WhatsApp groups who wanted to know how a New Kingdom Egyptian would go. Look, I'll be honest with you now. I'm finding it difficult to see beyond 18 files.
Yeah, but as you know, I will find 18 files of mounted skilled shooters very good.
Yeah.
That's the sort of I've got in my Mongol, my Ilkhanid.
Yeah. The chariot armies are certainly even reasonable in an open, because they can do that shooting damage. I still think people have a way to go to learn how to counter strong. I shoot the chariots. Certainly, if you're interested in getting into using a chariot army, it's certainly a choice to consider. So I think we need to come on to some proper infantry army.
Can I just off what you said, just one last thought, Rich, about that people. I think you said about you can use chariot armies in more open circumstances as well. I think people underrate a lot of these, quote, biblical armies out of period. And I think that could be a hangover from other sets of rules where they only tend it to work in period. I think there's quite a lot of them, especially in the Egypt and Hatti book and the Assyria and Babylon, are perfectly viable in more open environments. I think people should look at them. So I'm going to lecture you all, dear listener.
There's some...
Here's a challenge. So which one of the three of us is going to take a biblical army, the London DT to Scotland?
Probably not me, because I haven't. I've only got 2 units painted up towards any chariot army at the moment.
Yes,
but there are chariot armies that could work perfectly well in that opening.
Right. So, Richard, you didn't use a chariot army.
So I went for the Sea Peoples. So the Sea Peoples list is not the most complicated. You can have obviously you've got instinctive general. You've got an unfortified or mobile camp. The mobile camp would be the wagons that are shown on the reliefs, Egyptian reliefs. So that's why the mobile is there. You can have 0 to 6 chariots. They're just average protected experienced javelin short spear. So they're going to be thoroughly outgunned by these more civilized types. You get chieftains and their retinues. They're the tribal loose superior protected javelin melee expert in charge. You get common warriors who are just tribal loose average with optional melee expert in charge. You can regrade some of those so they become unprotected but get experienced javelin with short spear. That would be a bit of an odd choice, I think, in more competition-oriented army, but is there for the historical accuracy. You can get a unit of migrant families, tribal, close, poor, unprotected, at a wonderful 22 points each in an 8 or 10. And for skirmishers, you just get javelin men, average unprotected, experience in combat, shy. And you have to have at least. So the army I went for is pretty much my sort of standard tribal army. Two talented instinctive generals, two competent instinctive. The tweak I put in was having an internal ally, a Luca ally, I called it, for one of the talented instinctive generals. They 3 of the units, 1 of chieftains and 2 of warriors, of the ally. The army essentially is 1 unit of chariots, 4 units of chieftains, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 units of common warriors, and then 3 units of 6 skirmishers, all downgraded, essentially to act as a screen for the first round of chariot shooting to take the sting on chariots by just sticking them as a thin line in front of warriors. Those skirmishing units come in at 84 points each, so about the cost of 1 base of the rest of the infantry. So if it keeps your infantry going for an extra bound, that can make all the difference. The PBS comes out at 6, the scouting at 2. To be honest, yeah, I'd like terrain, but it's an army you've got to expect you're not going to get a terrain, and any terrain you do get is a bonus. I don't actually mind invading too much. It gets you up battlefield quicker, so your opponent has less rounds of shooting. You've got to keep... The drawback with this as a tribal army against a shooting army is you have to use the cards to charge, which means that you don't, unlike if they're devastating charges, they get free charge, which then means you can use cards to prompt through. So I find it hard to work. I mean, if I was knowing I was fighting a entirely chariot army, I'm not sure I would choose the melee expert, because essentially you need numbers to absorb all the skilled shooting casualties you're going to take. But the advantage of the melee expert is if the chariots charge you, you're going to take them down with a bit of luck. So I left them. The shoot and charge, I took on the optimistic hope that I might get a few charges where I could actually throw the javelins in and get a lucky slow. It was an idea that might make the chariots run away rather than skirmish. But against superior chariots, because they also get better bonus of to add 1 dice if skirmishing away. That's a bit of it. So that was the army. 11 tugs. It's perhaps not as big as you might expect. I think it's not a entirely hopeless competition army. All those tribal loose infantry sound vulnerable, but with the melee expert, they can actually probably give quite a few armies a run for their money, is my view.
Yeah, I'm really keen on short spear melee as a combination. Obviously, being loose if they more open. In an open competition and we're trying to stop a big night charge, they might have trouble. But as all rounders, I'd agree. They're not. The unit size makes them not as vulnerable as you might think. Can I just ask one question? Because just looking at the actual Sea People's list, notice one thing that's slightly unusual, and you haven't taken advantage of it, which I suspect is points based, is that unlike a lot of lists, those superior chieftains and their retinue can actually be in 8s.
Yes.
Sorry.
You're quite right. A lot of the armies, we restrict the superior ones to 6s. The logic of 8s, I guess, was because these guys did disrupt the Mycenaean and Hittite empires. So I thought they perhaps deserved an inch.
I think being in 6s meant you could have 1 per command, though.
the same restriction exists in the CPU's list. You can't have more than one.
But you've got 4 commands. So if you had them in 8.
Yeah, if you have them in 8s, you can only have them in 3 commands. That's not.
I mean, I forget the points. Forget it, but 8 of those formidable.
I have to say, I do like your choice of taking the shoot and charge. I think that is sensible. Certainly sensible in period, where one of your big enemies is going to be enemy chariots. That's a good choice, because to some degree a lot of the, as you look at Ray and my lists, we've got a lot of chariot units in 4s. So getting a bit lucky, or if you capture them, they can. The dreaded white dice can whittle them down.
Yeah, I mean the unskilled.
Where's the white dice coming?
Can always get lucky.
Sorry, I was thinking of the combat, Ray. Yeah, not the shooting.
Sorry, buddy.
Yeah. I mean the unskilled black dice you get an unskilled javelin. It sounds. I mean, okay, you've only got a 1 in 6 chance per file of getting a wound, but that combined with the combat that then follows when you're receiving a charge, if you're facing 4s of enemy chariots, then you've got a couple of wounds. You've already taken a base. You don't have to get that to take a second base, and then all of a sudden the chariot is a wound from breaking. And I think this happened to you in our game, Ray. That you had several chariot units reduced to being only 2 bases.
Absolutely, buddy. Absolutely.
And at that point, you're very reluctant to carry on the battle because you know that a lucky wound will break your unit.
So yeah, as I say, exactly. Yeah, that's why I think it's a very good choice, and it's not an expensive choice.
No.
Per base. Obviously, across the sheer number of bases you've got in this army, it does add up to a few hundred points, but I think they're well worth it.
So you're saying when you charge the chariots, expecting them to evade?
Yeah, I mean the chariots are you don't commit the chariots to the fight until you've maximised your opportunity to shoot. So when you're pushing the chariots back, as you have to, I mean, if you just sit back, eventually the chariots get to bits. So you have to push the chariots back and back and back. And if they get within 2 base, you can suddenly use your shoot and charge to shoot them. If you get it doesn't happen very often, but occasionally you get the wound in the S and the chariot is slowed by 2 base widths. Because of that risk, the chariot controller may choose to run away rather than skirmish. And then, of course, they're shooting at less effective. So the shoot and charge definitely helps increase your chances of surviving long enough to push the chariots to the table edge where they have to charge you, and hopefully you defeat them. Not always. Sometimes they break through.
Yes, but you're maximising your chances by taking it.
It's always a case of if you're using the shooty army, you've got to maximise your shots. If you're using the infantry army, you've got to minimise, and that's where the screen of javelin and the shoot and charge all help out.
Yeah. And I have to say, in our game, I mean, literally, you were the attacker. You did get a bit of terrain, not just to anchor one side of your army on. You did use the javelinman for ablative wounds. I think you played. Honestly, you played a absolutely, I'm going to say rock steady game, but that sounds a bit patronising. But you played absolutely as you knew you had to.
Yeah.
And I think my army, it was a bit more flighty, wasn't it? It was a bit more, if a couple of things went the wrong way, it could be a bit of a paper bag. But if I just can't remember the game that well, but I know it was a damn close run thing.
Yeah, it was close enough that at many points I thought I was going to lose the battle, and I was slightly surprised at the end I'd won it.
Well, it sounds like it was a good game.
It was.
Which is ultimately what we're after, isn't it?
Yeah.
And to get a good game from 2 such contrasting armies, I think is one of the strengths of MeG.
Yeah.
A lot of rule sets really struggle when you've got an entirely shooty army against mounted shooty army against an infantry army.
Oh yeah, I think it's definitely one of Meg's big strengths. I do remember. I always remember a game we had, Richard. I think it was a Boards and Swords in Derby. I assassinated. You had some sort of Germanic, basically foot army. I do remember we had a really good game. At the end of it, you did comment if we had played that under insert previous sets of rules of your choice that we had played many games previously, we'd have had, well, certainly you as the foot army would have had a desperately dull 3 hours.
Yeah, there's certainly no dullness in it.
Yeah, no, they work really well, and it's from the player who uses the shooty cavalry a lot. You really do have to keep you on your toes. Whereas under some other previous sets, you could do it a bit on autopilot, and you could make a few daft moves, and you'd always be able to get out the way and stuff. If anybody's does have a foot army and they're facing a skirmishing mounted army, keep at it. The back edge of the table, or as a game Richard mentioned in the last podcast, where shooty cavalry army had lots of woods to its rear.
Yeah, that's
a nightmare.
That was genius. And also, any mounted you've got, mix them in with your foot, so you've always got a chance of catching.
You have to be careful doing that, Ray. I know you like it, and you've done it a bit, so you've got experience. I remember some games we've played and of other people doing it, and it's very easy for the cavalry, if they're intermixed, to just get isolated ahead of their supporting infantry, and then the shooting army just turns around, picks on them, blows them away. They've picked up a tug, you've got a hole in your line.
I use the chariots in the Sea People's Army as the sweeper.
Yeah, the fire brigade, aren't they?
Because one of the chariot units is going to break through, is my assumption. And if you don't have something to put against it, then almost inevitably just turn around, flank, in no time at all, sweep your whole line away.
Yeah.
So you've got to have that, and the chariots are the mobile bit enabled.
It is in a way, although they don't jump off the page as something spectacular in the army. Again, they're almost first thing on the roster because you need that sweeper.
In the battle against Ray, they did save the situation, because I don't know if you remember, Ray, but you did get one of your chariot units through, and then I did get some lucky shooting with my experienced javelins. Much to Ray's disgust.
I can imagine.
So guys, in time-honoured fashion, I'll set the challenge. We're going to a biblical chariot period competition. Which of the three armies, as written tonight, would you take?
I'd take mine. I'd take the Hittites, and that is partly because, as I said right at the beginning, earlier on, I have a soft spot for them. Don't ask me why. I've always quite liked the Hittites for some reason. So I would take my list. Or I'd take a Hittite list.
You're always bending the rules, aren't you?
Yes, I know.
As written tonight, which of the
three...
then I'm going to answer it exactly the same way. I would take my army. I would take the Kingdom of Egyptians. But I'd fiddle around with the list a bit. So there you go.
Yeah, of the three armies we've discussed tonight, I would take either the Egyptian or, I'm afraid, Nick, I wouldn't take the Hittite stand. My favourite army is actually Mitanni.
Will Denham will love you for that, because he's got a Mitanni.
So, which I have taken.
And I should imagine there'll be a few Mitannis in where, it's not Reading anymore, is it? It's wherever we're going for Ascot for warfare. There'll be some Mitannis at that. I would imagine.
I expect there'll be one with Wills. And why not? It's a big chariot army. Get lots of chariots on the table. So I'm not sure there'll be multiple ones, because there's I think I have a suspicion we'll see quite a lot of Assyrians at warfare.
Oh, who would bring an Assyrian army?
I know you've got one. I'm painting one, and I've got recollections of at least two other people saying they're painting them or have them.
I'm about 10 basis of basing away from having a fully painted army ready for.
I tell you, the Middle Assyrian is quite a good one as well.
So it's the early Neo-Assyrian. I have in my possession a list that was vouchsafed to me that has been drawn up by one Olivier Juclat, a man of no inconsiderable skill and a good list composer. So that's one of those. I think if he says it's a good army, I think I'll pay attention.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Right. Well, so
the Assyrians as a whole, you can get some really, really lovely looking armies out of them.
Yeah, they look great.
As you can with the New Kingdom Egyptian, as you mentioned earlier, Ray.
Yeah, but what I like about the Assyrians, it's a proper combined army.
Again, some of the Assyrian lists have good choices and varied choices. You can get different sort of armies out now.
Full fat chariots that actually hit people.
Oh, the later Sargadid ones, the big wheelie bins with armoured horse and stuff like that. Yeah, they're very specialist. I suspect they're actually quite difficult to use.
Yeah, good threat though.
Yeah, they're not something you necessarily lead with. You insert them at the appropriate point, and then they could be quite devastating.
So we talked about the last podcast. Our next competition is Cross and Crescent. All the tickets have been sold. Lists are due in if you're a listener tonight and you're going to Cross and Crescent. I know Nick is now going to say he's already sent his.
That's because I have.
And I think they're due by I'm going to say the 9th or something like that, the 9th of August.
The email or the thing I saw said before the 8th.
Go before the 8th of August, get your lists in, give the list checkers.
Does that mean 11:59 on the 7th of August?
Well, how many people will do that? Loads, yeah.
Well, you will, Ray.
Absolutely.
No, I decided, as I did actually with Armageddon, as a way to stop myself dithering and just get my finger out and just send a list in.
For once, I'm fairly sure my list will not be returned by the list. Yeah, right.
Right. We're going to bribe Jeff to send yours back with a random made-up error.
Yeah, even for some spurious reason. Right, guys, we are... we're just two now, but it was very nice. Now, do we have any thoughts about what our next podcast is going to be about? Give the listeners a little intro to the next one. I suppose we could wait till after Cross and Crescent and do a Cross and Crescent podcast, but coming up at some point, we've definitely been asked to do a podcast about paint, all the hobby craft part of the hobby, the painting, the base, the transfers. So that's something for the future. What else have we got in mind in terms of more of a historical one?
This is a blatant plug, so I'll get in now. The Society of Ancients Battle Day on August at Shaw House in Newbury is refighting the Battle of Bosworth. And I think it would be nice to do a 15th century medieval.
I'd be up for that.
Well, on the basis that I'll be there helping the refight, yes, we should definitely.
And thinking about it, Cross and Crescent is a good 3 weeks away, Ray. Obviously, doing another podcast before then will depend on schedules, whether we've got free time. But we might be able to do one before Cross and Crescent, and then do a post Cross and Crescent one, like we've done with the.
So we could do the 15th century. We could do the 15th century one next, yeah.
Although, do I remember that you mentioned something about people had mentioned they would like something on painting, basing, modelling?
Yeah, and I just said that, but the point.
I'm sorry, it must be getting late. But in one ear and out the other. Yeah,
I just said that, but I just think that takes quite a bit of organisation. We are having an editorial meeting in front of our listeners.
Oh, they're getting to see what we're thinking about.
Yes. But that's on the cards. But I think that takes a bit of organisation, and I don't think not something we want to rush. We need to look. Can't be us three duffers doing a thing about painting and basing, can it? So
that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, we need to bring in some experts. So that will take a bit of organisation. So I mean, the next podcast could be on. Richard, think of something 15th century. Is that it? Just 15th century, or?
Well, we could do Wars of the Roses.
Go on, let's do Wars of the Roses.
Wars of the Roses. My horse, a horse, my kingdom.
My kingdom for a horse. On that note, note of dubious historical intent, we shall leave our listeners now, and we'll say commit to our next podcast will be on the war.
Sorted.
Cheers, guys.
Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure as always, and I shall see you both soon.
Cheers.